Waiter helps special boy in restaurant Millionaire. Father sees everything from afar and takes action. A boy of about 8 years old, with brown hair and the characteristic features of Down syndrome, fidgeted restlessly in his chair. Next, to him, a woman of about 40, formally dressed, was trying to make him eat, visibly frustrated. "Come on, Gabriel, just one more spoonful. Your father will be furious if he finds out you didn't eat again," she murmured, constantly checking her watch. The boy turned his face away at each attempt, pushing the plate away. Some people at neighboring tables began to cast disapproving glances. Matthew, the waiter, finished serving the other plates and, without thinking twice, approached the table. "Excuse me, ma'am, can I help with anything?" he asked politely. The woman, who he would later discover was Denise Fields, executive secretary and temporary nanny for the boy, looked at him with a mixture of relief and suspicion. "Unless you can get this boy to eat something, I don't think so," she replied dryly. "I've been with him for an hour and need to get back to the office. His father has an important meeting and asked me to feed him, but it's impossible." Matthew observed the plate of spaghetti bolognese, practically untouched, and the sad expression on the boy's face. "May I try?" he offered, gently pulling up a chair. "Sometimes children respond better to strangers. My sister has Down syndrome, and I know how challenging it can be." Denise hesitated for a moment, but her phone rang. She answered quickly, and her expression changed. "I need to take this call. It's from the office. Could you, just for 5 minutes?" Without waiting for a response, the woman moved outside the restaurant, speaking hurriedly on the phone. Matthew sat down beside the boy, who looked at him curiously. "Hi, champ, my name is Matthew, and yours?" The boy didn't respond verbally, but pointed to the ID badge he wore around his neck. "Gabriel Thompson," along with a medical identification. "Nice to meet you, Gabriel. You know, this pasta looks delicious, but I think it's too hot, isn't it?" Matthew theatrically blew on the plate. "How about we try it together to see if it's cooled down?" Gabriel watched Matthew's every movement intensely. The waiter took a clean fork, twirled some pasta and tried it. It's delicious, but I think we need a special trick to make it even better." He looked around as if about to share a secret, and took a small notepad and pencil from his pocket. Quickly, he drew a smiling face on the paper. "This is Mr. Pasta, and he's very sad because nobody wants to eat him. Can we help him?" Gabriel's eyes lit up. He took the drawing, observed it for a few seconds, and then, to Matthew's surprise, nodded affirmatively. "Great. Shall we make Mr. Pasta happy?" Matthew twirled a small amount of pasta on the fork and, making funny voices, brought it to Gabriel's mouth. "Hello, Gabriel. It's me, Mr. Pasta, and I really want to visit your tummy." To Matthew's delight, Gabriel opened his mouth and accepted the food, chewing slowly. His eyes sparkled with amusement as Matthew continued the game, transforming each forkful into a new adventure. What Matthew didn't know was that, on the other side of the restaurant, partially hidden by a decorative column, Richard Thompson, 45, one of the country's most successful businessmen, was watching the scene with a mixture of emotions. He had arrived at the restaurant a few minutes after Denise left to answer the phone call, and his first reaction upon seeing a stranger feeding his son was fury. Richard was about to intervene when something stopped him. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he saw his son Gabriel smiling while eating. Something so simple, so basic, that he had never been able to make happen despite all his power and money. Standing there, Richard felt simultaneously grateful and devastated. How could a complete stranger connect with Gabriel in a way that he, his own father, had never been able to? Denise returned to the restaurant and, seeing the scene, stopped abruptly. Her eyes moved nervously from the waiter feeding Gabriel to the corner where Richard was observing everything, motionless. She swallowed hard, anticipating trouble. Matthew, oblivious to all this, remained focused on Gabriel. "And now the last piece of Mr. Pasta wants to take a dive into your tummy. Splash!" Gabriel swallowed the last portion and clapped his hands, smiling broadly. It was the first time he had finished a meal in a restaurant without tantrums or tears. "Very good, champ. You were amazing." Matthew gently cleaned the corner of the boy's mouth with a napkin. "Now how about a drawing to celebrate?" He turned the page in his notepad and began to draw. Gabriel leaned in, watching attentively each stroke of the pencil. Matthew drew a cartoon version of Gabriel with a superhero cape. "This is Super Gabriel. The hero who defeated the villain evil pastor by swallowing him whole, he explained, handing the drawing to the boy. Gabriel took the drawing and hugged it to his chest, his eyes conveying a gratitude that words couldn't express. At that moment, Denise quickly approached. "I need to take Gabriel now. Thank you for the help." Her voice was tense, her eyes continuously casting worried glances in Richard's direction. Matthew stood up. "It was a pleasure meeting. You, Gabriel, I hope to see you here again." Gabriel, who until then hadn't uttered any sound, surprised everyone by babbling something that sounded like "Thew." He pointed to Matthew and repeated, "Thew." "That's right, champ, Matthew. You're very smart." Matthew smiled, deeply touched. Denise quickly took Gabriel by the hand and practically dragged him out, leaving Matthew watching them depart, feeling a strange mixture of joy and emptiness. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. What Matthew didn't know was that Richard Thompson was also leaving the restaurant at that moment, taking care not to be seen. His private driver was waiting on the sidewalk with the door of the armored Mercedes open. "To the office, sir?" asked the driver. Richard hesitated, still processing what he had witnessed. "No, Anthony. Let's go home. Cancel my afternoon appointments. Say urgent family matters have come up." The next day, around 11:30 a.m., the manager of Flavors and Aromas restaurant, Steve Morgan, called Matthew to his office. "Did something happen, Steve?" asked Matthew, concerned. Although he was an exemplary employee, he always feared being dismissed. The waiter's salary, plus tips, was what maintained not only his studies, but also helped his mother with the expenses of the house where they lived in the Riverside neighborhood. Steve, a middle-aged man with a well-groomed mustache, seemed nervous. "Matthew, you served a child with Down syndrome yesterday, correct? A boy named Gabriel?" Matthew's heart raced. "Yes, I did." Was there a problem? His companion seemed satisfied. "It's not quite that." Steve flipped through some papers on his desk. "I just received a call from Richard Thompson's office. Do you know that name?" Matthew furrowed his brow, thoughtful. "It sounds familiar. Is he some politician?" Steve almost choked. "Politician? Matthew, Richard Thompson is only one of the country's biggest businessmen. Thompson Group Construction Shopping Centers, that new tower downtown. Don't you read the newspapers?" "Sorry, Steve. Between college assignments and shifts here, I barely have time to sleep, let alone keep up with the business world," Matthew explained. "Well, that doesn't matter now. What matters is that the boy you helped yesterday is Gabriel. Thompson, Richard's only son. And they'll be coming to lunch here today, Richard himself with his son, and he specifically requested that you serve them." Matthew felt a chill in his stomach. Had he done something wrong? Why would such an important man specifically request to be served by him? "Listen, Matthew," Steve continued, "I don't know what happened yesterday, but this is an important customer, very important. So, whatever your system is for dealing with the boy, do it again. Do it better if possible, understood?" Matthew nodded, still processing the information. "Understood, Steve, I'll do my best." At precisely 12:45 p.m., a murmur ran through the restaurant. Richard Thompson, in an impeccable Italian suit, was entering the establishment, firmly holding the hand of Gabriel, who wore a navy blue polo shirt and khaki pants. There was no sign of Denise or any other companion. The maitre d' led them to the best table in the house, strategically positioned with a view of the internal gardens, but isolated enough to ensure privacy. Steve personally approached to greet them, making a discreet gesture for Matthew to approach. "Mr. Thompson, it's an honor to have you back in our establishment. This is Matthew, who will serve you today, as requested." Richard, a tall man with gray at his temples and penetrating eyes, extended his hand. "Matthew, correct? Pleasure to meet you formally." Matthew shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the watch that probably cost more than his annual salary. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Thompson." His eyes, however, automatically went to Gabriel, who, as soon as he saw him, smiled broadly. "Thew!" exclaimed the boy, surprising his father. "Hello, champ. Good to see you again," replied Matthew, bending down to Gabriel's height. Richard observed the interaction intensely. "My son seems to remember you well. Children have an incredible memory, Mr. Thompson, especially for people who treat them with kindness." A momentary silence settled, as if Matthew's words carried a greater weight than he intended. "Well, let's sit down," Richard finally said. "Gabriel, would you like to sit next to Matthew during lunch?" Gabriel nodded enthusiastically. "That wouldn't be very appropriate, sir," intervened Matthew politely. "I'm the waiter, not a guest." Richard studied him for a moment. "Today you're a bit of both, Matthew. Please sit. Steve has already been informed about this special arrangement." Reluctantly, but without choice, Matthew sat next to Gabriel, who immediately pulled the notepad from the pocket of the waiter's uniform. "Do you want me to draw again, champ?" asked Matthew, receiving an affirmative nod. Richard observed everything, with an expression difficult to decipher. Finally he spoke. "He barely speaks. He never shows this enthusiasm with strangers. With anyone, actually." Matthew, who was beginning to draw a boat for Gabriel, responded without taking his eyes off the paper. "Maybe he just needs a little more time and patience, Mr. Thompson. Each child has their own pace, especially children with Down syndrome." "You seem to understand the subject. My younger sister, Isabella, has Down syndrome. I grew up with her, learning to understand her needs and her unique way of communicating. That's why I chose to study education, specializing in special education. I want to help children like her, like Gabriel." Richard looked genuinely surprised. "You're a student?" "Yes, sir. 4th year of education at State University, morning classes. I work here to pay for college." A different waiter approached to take their orders. Richard requested the daily special for himself and looked at Gabriel. "He'll want spaghetti bolognese again," he said, and then looked at Matthew. "Unless you suggest something different." Matthew thought for a moment. "Gabriel, would you like to try something new today?" he asked the boy directly, who looked hesitantly at his father. "It's okay, son. You can choose." Gabriel pointed to the drawing Matthew was making, a boat sailing under the sun. A boat. How about fish? Fish swim in the sea, like the boat," suggested Matthew. Gabriel nodded positively. "He'll have the cod fillet with lemon sauce," Matthew told the waiter, who noted it and walked away. "Interesting method of communication," commented Richard. "Gabriel understands everything we say, Mr. Thompson. He just prefers to express himself. In other ways, drawings can be a very useful bridge." Lunch proceeded surprisingly well. Gabriel ate almost all of the fish, with Matthew occasionally helping and keeping him entertained with stories about pirates and hidden treasures that he quickly illustrated in his notepad. Richard ate in silence, observing each interaction, each smile from his son, each small achievement that seemed so normal for other families, but was extraordinary for them. At the end of the meal, Richard excused himself to go to the bathroom, leaving Matthew and Gabriel alone for a few minutes. "You were incredible today, champ. Ate everything like a real pirate," praised Matthew, drawing a small medal next to the boat. Gabriel took the pencil from Matthew's hand, and with clumsy but determined movements made a line connecting a stick figure inside the boat to another stick figure on the shore. Then he looked at Matthew inquiringly. "Are they two friends?" asked Matthew, "the sailor and his friend on the beach?" Gabriel shook his head and pointed to himself and then to the figure in the boat. Next he pointed to the door through which Richard had left and then to the figure on the shore. Understanding hit Matthew like a wave. "Oh, I see, it's you and your dad. You feel like he's distant on the shore while you're sailing alone?" Gabriel nodded energetically, his eyes suddenly watery. At that exact moment, Richard returned to the table and, noticing the change in atmosphere, asked, "Is everything okay here?" Matthew quickly turned the page in his notepad. "Everything's great, Mr. Thompson. Gabriel was just showing me his artistic skills." When the bill came, Richard paid it without even looking at the amount, adding a generous tip. Before leaving, he addressed Matthew. "I'd like to talk more with you privately. Would you be available to come to my house tomorrow? You'll be well compensated for your time, of course." The proposal caught Matthew completely by surprise. I have class in the morning, but I'm free from 2 p.m., sir." "Perfect." Richard handed him a card. "This is my personal contact. My driver will pick you up at the university. Send your address by message." Gabriel tugged at his father's sleeve and pointed to the notepad in Matthew's hands. "Ah, of course." Richard turned to Matthew. "Gabriel would like to take the drawing, if you don't mind. Matthew smiled, carefully detached the page with the boat and the stick figures, and handed it to Gabriel, who held it as if it were a treasure. "See you." "Tomorrow, champ," he said goodbye, lightly tousling the boy's hair. "It was a pleasure getting to know you better, Mr. Thompson." Richard nodded formally. "Until tomorrow, Matthew." As he watched them leave, Matthew felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. What could a man like Richard Thompson want with a simple education student? The next day, as arranged, a black Mercedes waited for Matthew at the university exit. The driver, Anthony, politely opened the door for him. "Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thompson is waiting for you." During the journey to the Garden Heights neighborhood, Matthew looked out the window, observing the city gradually transform. The crowded buildings and busy commercial areas gave way to tree-lined streets and mansions hidden behind high walls. Finally, they stopped in front of an imposing gate. After identification, they entered an impressive property. Meticulously maintained gardens surrounded a contemporary mansion with straight lines and large glass windows. Anthony led Matthew to the entrance, where they were received by a middle-aged housekeeper. "Good afternoon, Mr. Sullivan. I'm Mrs. Helen, the house caretaker. Mr. Thompson is in his office and asked me to take you there." Matthew followed Helen through the elegant corridors of the mansion, noting the minimalist yet luxurious decoration. Paintings by famous American artists adorned the walls, and the few pieces of furniture appeared to be exclusive design items. Helen knocked softly on a dark wooden door and opened it after hearing a "come in" from inside. Richard's office was a spacious environment, with an entire glass wall facing the gardens and pool. The businessman was sitting behind a solid wood desk, typing something on his laptop. He looked up when Matthew entered. "Matthew, thank you for coming. Please sit down." He indicated a leather armchair in front of the desk. "Thank you for having me, Mr. Thompson," replied Matthew, trying to hide his nervousness. Richard closed the laptop and faced Matthew directly. "Let's get straight to the point. I witnessed your interaction with Gabriel at the restaurant the day before yesterday. I wasn't planning to show up, but there was an unexpected development in the meeting, and I decided to check on things." Matthew felt a chill down his spine. "I hope I didn't cross any boundaries, sir. I just wanted to help." "And you did. I saw my son smile and interact in a way I hadn't seen actually that I'd never seen before." Richard stood up and walked to the window. "Since my wife, Louise, left us 3 years ago, Gabriel has withdrawn more and more. The specialists say it's a combination of the syndrome and the trauma of loss." "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson." Richard waved his hand as if dismissing the sympathy. "The point is, in 10 minutes you achieved more progress with my son than therapists, speech therapists, and specialists have achieved in years. And yesterday he ate without having a meltdown. He interacted. He practically spoke." He turned to face Matthew. "I want to hire you." The statement caught Matthew completely off guard. "Hire me? For?" "To work with Gabriel. Specialized. Companion, private teacher, therapist. Call it what you will, the title doesn't matter, the results do." "Mr. Thompson, I'm just a student. I don't have the necessary qualifications to—" "Qualifications?" Richard laughed, a dry sound without humor. "I have a team of qualified professionals who can barely get my son to sit at the table to eat. You have something more valuable. A natural connection with him." Matthew pondered for a moment. "Are you offering me a job as Gabriel's caretaker?" "I'm offering more than that. I want you to move here, to the guest area of the house. You'll have your own apartment, with an independent entrance. You'll be responsible for Gabriel when he's not at his special school. In exchange, in addition to a salary that will be substantially higher than what you earn as a waiter, I'll pay for the rest of your education and any specialization you wish to pursue afterwards." The offer was so unexpected and generous that Matthew was momentarily speechless. "I know it's a radical change," continued Richard, interpreting the silence as hesitation, "but think about how much this could benefit Gabriel. And being honest, it would be good for me too. My schedule is impossible. I travel constantly. Having someone I can trust taking care of him would be an immense relief." "And what about Denise, the woman who was with Gabriel at the restaurant?" Richard's expression hardened slightly. "Denise is my executive assistant. It was never her function to take care of Gabriel, although she occasionally does when we're out of options. She has other responsibilities. Matthew took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. Mr. Thompson, your offer is extremely generous, but I need to be honest. I don't have professional experience with children with special needs, beyond what I've learned with my sister and in college. And I have family commitments. I live with my mother and help with household expenses. As for experience, you'll learn with practice, just as you did with your sister. As for your family, your salary will be more than enough to continue, helping at home even without living there, and you'll have regular days off, of course. Richard moved closer, sitting on the edge of the desk, directly in front of Matthew. Look, I'm not asking for an immediate answer. Think about it, talk to your family, but I'd like you to get to know the house better and especially to see how Gabriel reacts to your presence over a longer period. As if it had been arranged, they heard light knocks on the office door. Helen opened it partially. Mr. Richard, Gabriel has returned from school and is asking about the visitor. Somehow he knows the young man is here. Richard smiled, a genuine smile that softened his serious features. See? He senses your presence. Let's go to him. Matthew followed Richard to an area of the house that had clearly been specially designed for Gabriel. It was a spacious and colorful area with a low climbing wall, a mini library, space for arts, and a small sensory circuit. Gabriel was sitting at a round table, focused on a puzzle, accompanied by a young woman whom Matthew presumed to be his teacher or therapist. As soon as he saw Matthew, the boy dropped the pieces and ran toward him, hugging his legs. Thu! Hey, champ, I missed you. Matthew bent down to properly return the hug. What are you building over there? Gabriel took Matthew by the hand and led him to the table, proudly pointing to the partially assembled puzzle. A seascape with boats, similar to the drawing Matthew had made at the restaurant. Wow, it's looking amazing. You really like the sea, huh? The woman who was accompanying Gabriel stood up and extended her hand. You must be Matthew. I'm Carly Ross, Gabriel's occupational therapist. He hasn't stopped talking about you since yesterday. Talking? Literally talking? Asked Matthew, surprised. Well, in his way. He showed everyone the drawing and kept repeating "Thew" several times. It's more communication than we've been getting in months. Richard observed the interaction closely, noting how Gabriel seemed to flourish in Matthew's presence. Carly, could you give us a moment? I'd like Matthew to spend some time with Gabriel, to see how they get along together. Of course, Mr. Thompson. Carly smiled at Matthew. Good luck, he's not difficult, he just needs us to understand his rhythm. After Carly left, Richard approached Matthew. I'll leave you alone for an hour or two. I have some calls to make. Helen will be nearby if you need anything, and Matthew? Yes, sir? Be yourself, that's what's worked so far. After Richard left, Matthew turned his attention to Gabriel, who was already pulling him toward a shelf full of games and activities. What do you want to do first, buddy? Let's see what we have here. The hours flew by. Matthew and Gabriel put together puzzles, read books, with Matthew doing all the character voices to Gabriel's delight, drew pictures, and even had a small music session with the percussion instruments available in the room. At one point, when they were sitting on the colorful floor building a city with wooden blocks, Matthew realized he was being watched. Looking at the half-open door, he saw Richard standing there, observing them with an indescribable expression, something between admiration and deep sadness. When he realized he had been noticed, Richard entered the room. Looks like you two are having fun. Gabriel smiled at his father, but remained focused on his construction. Your son is amazing, Mr. Thompson, said Matthew sincerely. He has an impressive ability to focus and is extremely creative. Is that so? The surprise was evident in Richard's voice. School reports always mention concentration problems. Well, maybe it's a matter of finding what really interests him. With the blocks, for example, I noticed he prefers to build tall structures instead of wide ones. When I tried to guide him to make a more extensive city, he got frustrated. But when I suggested we make the buildings as tall as possible, he immediately engaged. Richard observed his son for a few moments. I never noticed that. It's normal, Mr. Thompson. Sometimes we're so concerned with what we think children should do that we don't notice what they really want to do. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Later, after Gabriel had a snack and was taken to his physical therapy session with another professional, Richard led Matthew back to the office. So, what did you think? Matthew didn't hesitate. I loved spending this time with him. Gabriel is a wonderful child, full of potential. And what about my proposal? I still need to think and talk to my family, but Matthew paused, reflecting. If I decide to accept, I would have some conditions. Richard raised his eyebrows, visibly surprised by the audacity. Conditions? Yes, sir. First, I would need to continue my college education at the current schedule. Second, I would like to work together with the other professionals who care for Gabriel, not replace them. Third, I would need the autonomy to implement educational strategies based on what I'm learning, provided they're previously discussed. With you, of course. A discreet smile appeared on Richard's lips. Impressive. Not many people have the courage to impose conditions when negotiating with me. I'm not negotiating, Mr. Thompson. I'm thinking about what would be best for Gabriel. And for me to effectively help him, these conditions are important. Richard studied Matthew for a long moment, as if evaluating him in a new light. Your conditions are perfectly reasonable, Matthew. In fact, I appreciate your commitment to your education and your collaborative vision. He extended his hand. So do we have an agreement pending only your family consultation? Matthew shook the offered hand. Yes, sir. I promise to give my final answer by tomorrow night. Excellent. Anthony will take you home now. And Matthew? Yes? Thank you. For today, it was the first time in years that I've seen my son truly happy. On the way back home to the Riverside neighborhood, Matthew observed the city through the Mercedes window, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Life had just offered him an opportunity he had never imagined, working in a mansion, with a salary. That would solve his family's financial problems, continuing his studies without worries, and most importantly, helping a special child. It seemed too good to be true, and his life experience had taught him to be suspicious of very generous offers. When the Mercedes stopped in front of the small two-story house where he lived with his mother and sister, Matthew thanked Anthony and got out of the car, feeling out of place seeing the luxury vehicle parked on his simple street where neighbors were already peeking through windows. Before he could open the gate, the house door opened, and his mother, Mrs. Cindy, appeared with a concerned expression that transformed into confusion upon seeing the Mercedes driving away. Matthew, what's going on? Whose car was that? Are you okay? I'm great, Mom, he replied, hugging her. We have a lot to talk about. Where's Isabella? In the living room, watching cartoons. Matthew, you're scaring me. What happened? Nothing bad, Mom, I promise. In fact, it could be something very good for all of us. Inside the modest house, Isabella, 15, was absorbed in a TV program. When she saw her brother, her face lit up with a radiant smile. Thu! Thu's here! Matthew smiled at the coincidence, the same nickname that Gabriel used. Hi, Bella, how are you, Princess? He sat with his mother and sister in the simple but cozy living room and told them everything that had happened in the last few days. The encounter with Gabriel at the restaurant, Richard's surprise visit, the job offer, and all its implications. Mrs. Cindy listened with growing attention, her expressions alternating between surprise, pride, and concern. Son, this seems extraordinary, but you barely know these people, and living in their house away from us. I know, Mom. I was cautious too. But after spending the afternoon with Gabriel, seeing how well he responds to my presence, I feel like I can really help him. And what about Isabella? You know how much she misses you when you work at the restaurant. Imagine living somewhere else. Isabella, who was following the conversation with limited interest, surprisingly intervened. Thu help boy like Bella? Matthew smiled, taking his sister's hands. That's right, Bella. A special boy like you. His name is Gabriel, and he also has difficulty speaking sometimes. Isabella seemed to consider this for a moment, her face concentrated in the effort to process the information. Thu helps Gabriel, Thu good. Mrs. Cindy discreetly wiped away a tear. Despite all maternal concern, she knew that her son had a special gift for connecting with people, especially those whom the world often neglected. How much are they offering? she finally asked. Matthew mentioned the amount, and Mrs. Cindy almost choked. "That's more than I make in 6 months, Matthew." "I know, Mum. We could pay off Bella's treatment debts, finish the bathroom renovation, and you wouldn't need to do extra cleaning jobs anymore." "But what about you, son? Is this what you want? Taking care of another child when you already have so much responsibility here?" Matthew reflected for a moment. "I want to be a teacher, Mom, specialized in inclusive education. What better practical experience could I have? And besides," he paused, searching for the right words, "when I saw Gabriel, when I saw how he opened up to me, I felt it was what I should do. As if all my time with Bella had prepared me for this." Mrs. Cindy studied her son, seeing in him no longer the boy who had taken on too many responsibilities when his father abandoned them, but a determined and compassionate man. "If that's what your heart tells you, son, then go. We'll be fine. Bella and I will manage, and you can visit whenever you have time off." That night, after his mother and sister had gone to sleep, Matthew remained awake, reflecting on the decision he was about to make. There was something in the dynamics of the Thompson household that intrigued him. Why would a man as powerful and busy as Richard seem so disconnected from his own son? Why did Gabriel, surrounded by professionals and resources, remain isolated, in his own world until a simple waiter managed to reach him? The next day after his classes, Matthew sent a message to Richard confirming that he accepted the proposal. The response was immediate. He could move in over the weekend, and his commitments at the restaurant would be personally resolved by Richard. On Saturday morning, Matthew emotionally said goodbye to his mother and sister, promising to visit them whenever possible and call daily. Anthony waited with the Mercedes to transport his few possessions, mostly books, clothes, and some personal items, to his new temporary home. Upon arriving at the Thompson mansion, Helen received him and led him to the guest annex, a small complete apartment with a bedroom, private bathroom, a compact living room, and even a small kitchen. "Mr. Thompson thought you might like to have your own space," explained Helen. "But the main meals are served in the main house, should you prefer to join them." "It's much more than I expected," commented Matthew, admiring the impeccable and elegant space, so different from the small room he shared with his sister at home. "Mr. Gabriel is at the pool with the physical therapist now. When you finish settling in, you can go meet them. Mr. Thompson had to leave for an emergency meeting, but he left instructions for you to make yourself at home." Matthew quickly organized his things and headed to the pool area, located at the back of the property. The environment was stunning, an infinity pool with a view of the lush garden surrounded by lounges and an elegant gazebo. Gabriel was in the water using arm floats, accompanied by a young athletic man who guided him in exercises. "You must be the famous Matthew," the man greeted when he saw him approach. "I'm Ryan, Gabriel's physical therapist. This little guy hasn't stopped talking about you since Thursday." Gabriel, upon spotting Matthew, began to get agitated in the water, pointing and smiling. "The pool. I see, champ, you swim very well," replied Matthew, sitting on the edge of the pool and dipping his feet in the water. "Actually, we're working on that," explained Ryan. "Swimming is excellent for developing motor coordination and strengthening muscles which tend to be more hypertonic in people with Down syndrome." Matthew nodded. "My sister also does adapted swimming. It made a huge difference in her posture and endurance. I heard you have experience with Down syndrome. That will be great for Gabriel. We're almost finished here if you want to continue with him after." The weekend went smoothly, with Matthew and Gabriel establishing a comfortable routine. Richard returned only on Sunday night, seeming exhausted after a series of meetings. "How did everything go?" he asked Matthew, as they had coffee in the kitchen after Gabriel went to bed. "Very well. Gabriel is an incredible child. We did various activities, swimming, painting, even a bit of reading. He has enormous potential." Richard took a sip of coffee, thoughtful. "You know, when Louise was pregnant and we discovered that Gabriel had Down syndrome, I panicked, not because of the condition itself, but because I didn't know if I would be capable of being the father he needed." "And how did Mrs. Thompson react?" "Louise?" A sad smile crossed Richard's face. "She was extraordinary. An educator too, you know, university professor of literature. She simply said, We'll love him and help him be the best version of himself, as we would with any child. And that's what she did, until... Richard didn't complete the sentence, but it wasn't necessary. Louise's absence was a constant presence in the house, an almost tangible void. After she was gone, he continued after a pause, I buried myself in work. It was easier to deal with companies and business than with grief. My grief, Gabriel's grief. I hired the best professionals, but I never managed to do what you did in minutes, connect with him. Matthew chose his words carefully. Mr. Thompson, each relationship is unique. What I have with Gabriel isn't better or worse than what you have, it's just different. And perhaps with time I can help strengthen the connection between you two as well. Richard studied Matthew with renewed interest. That's an interesting perspective. Most people would assume that I'm hiring you to replace my presence in his life, not to build a bridge between us. No one can replace a father, Mr. Thompson, nor should they try. On Monday, the routine began to establish itself. Matthew went to college in the morning, while Gabriel attended his special school, accompanied by a designated driver. In the afternoon, when Matthew returned, he spent a few hours with Gabriel, implementing educational activities disguised as games. In one of the drawers in the activity room, Matthew found a notebook. After consulting with Helen, he discovered it was the activity journal that Louise kept before she died, recording Gabriel's progress and challenges. With emotion, Matthew decided to continue this legacy. Every night before going to sleep, he spent a few minutes recording the day's achievements, the new words that Gabriel tried to pronounce, the activities that engaged him the most. It was a way not only to document the child's development, but also to honor the mother who couldn't see her son grow up. On Wednesday of that first week, Matthew was focused on preparing materials for a sensory stimulation activity when Denise appeared in Gabriel's room, clearly uncomfortable with his presence. Mr. Thompson asked me to check on how things are. Going, she said, her professional tone barely disguising her disapproval. It seems you've completely settled in. Matthew smiled politely. We're adapting well. Gabriel is a wonderful child. Denise examined the materials spread out on the table. And what is this, some kind of game? It's a sensory activity. We're creating different textures to help Gabriel develop tactile discrimination, which assists in fine motor skills, and consequently in writing. Impressive, she commented, although her tone suggested otherwise. Who would have thought that a waiter would know so much about child development? Education student, actually, Matthew corrected gently. At that moment, Gabriel entered the room, returning from the bathroom. Upon seeing Denise, he stopped abruptly, his body language instantly changing. His shoulders hunched, and he cast an anxious look at Matthew. Hello, Gabriel, Denise greeted, her voice suddenly higher-pitched and artificial. Are you enjoying your new friend? Gabriel didn't respond, quickly moving to stand beside Matthew. It's okay, champ, Matthew assured him. Denise just came to visit us briefly. Actually, intervened Denise, I need to speak with you privately, Matthew. It's about Mr. Thompson's schedule for the weekend. Matthew hesitated, noting Gabriel's growing anxiety. Can we talk later? We're in the middle of an important activity. Unfortunately, no. Mr. Thompson is boarding for New York in an hour, and I need to confirm some details before that. Reluctantly, Matthew accompanied Denise to the hallway, but not before assuring Gabriel that he would return in a few minutes. What's your game? Asked Denise as soon as they were out of Gabriel's earshot. Pardon me? Don't play dumb. You appear out of nowhere, charm the child, win the boss's trust. Are you looking for an easy path to the Thompson money? Matthew was genuinely shocked. I don't have any game, Ms. Fields. I'm here to help Gabriel, that's all. Right. Denise crossed her arms. Look, I worked hard to get where I am, to earn Mr. Thompson's trust. It was me who took care of Gabriel in emergencies, who organized the specialists who kept everything running, and now you show up. I'm not trying to take your place if that's what concerns you. In fact, I believe we could work together. For Gabriel's benefit, Denise laughed without humor. How touching, but let me give you a warning. Mr. Thompson may be enchanted now, but he's a businessman. When he realizes that you're not as special as you think, that Gabriel isn't making the miraculous progress he expects, well, we'll see how long your luck lasts. Before Matthew could respond, they heard a noise coming from the activity room. Running back, they found Gabriel on the floor, surrounded by scattered activity materials, clearly in the midst of an anxiety attack. "Gabriel!" Matthew immediately knelt beside him. "What happened, champ?" The boy was breathing rapidly, his face red and wet with tears. He frantically pointed outside the room, then to Matthew, then outside again. "Did you think I had gone away?" Matthew asked softly. Gabriel nodded, sobbing. "I promised I would come back, remember? And Matthew always keeps his promises." He gently hugged Gabriel, feeling the small body trembling against his. "Breathe with me, champ. Slowly. That's it." Denise observed the scene with a complex expression, part surprise, part skepticism, and something that could be interpreted as guilt. "Maybe we should call someone. One of the therapists," she suggested, her tone no longer aggressive. "It's not necessary," replied Matthew, still calming Gabriel. "He's having a separation anxiety attack. It's common in children with Down syndrome, especially after a trauma." He didn't need to specify what trauma that would be. Louise's death had left Gabriel with a deep fear that the people he loved might suddenly disappear. Gradually, Gabriel's breathing normalized. Matthew took his notepad and began to draw, narrating as he did. "Once upon a time there was a brave boy named Gabriel. He had a friend named Matthew. One day Matthew said he was going to get something special and would be back soon. Gabriel was worried, but then he remembered that Matthew always kept his promises, and when Matthew returned he brought a magic gift." Gabriel watched the drawing form, his anxiety gradually transforming into curiosity. "Gift?" "Yes, a magic gift. But to discover what it is, we need to finish our special activity first. Will you help me collect the materials?" As Gabriel, now calmer, helped gather the scattered items, Denise observed with a new look of reluctant respect. How did you know what to do?" she asked softly, so only Matthew could hear. "Experience with my sister, and a lot of reading on the subject." Matthew paused, facing her directly. "I'm not here to replace anyone, Ms. Fields. I just want to help Gabriel develop his full potential." Something in Matthew's sincerity seemed to finally reach Denise. "I should have informed you about the schedule," she admitted. "Mr. Thompson will be in New York for the next 3 days, in meetings with investors. He asked me to let you know that you can use the pool freely and that if you need anything, you should contact him or me directly. Thank you for the information." Denise hesitated, as if wanting to say something more, but merely nodded and left the room, leaving Matthew and Gabriel with their activity. That night, after putting Gabriel to bed, Matthew sat on the small veranda of his annex, contemplating the starry sky and reflecting on the day's events. The incident with Denise had been unpleasant but understandable. In large houses like that, territories and hierarchies were established over time, and he was a newcomer threatening the status quo. But more concerning was Gabriel's reaction. The fear of abandonment that the boy demonstrated was profound and would need to be carefully addressed. While these thoughts occupied his mind, Matthew didn't notice Helen approaching until she spoke. "A beautiful night, isn't it?" He turned, surprised. "Helen, yes, really beautiful." The housekeeper smiled, handing him a steaming mug. "Hot chocolate. I thought you might want something comforting after today." "Thank you," replied Matthew, genuinely touched by the gesture. "How did you know about—" "Walls have ears in this house," she replied enigmatically. "And Gabriel isn't the only one who needs special care here." "What do you mean?" Helen sat in the chair next to him. "I've worked for the Thompson family for almost 20 years. I was here when Richard and Louise married, when Gabriel was born, when Louise became ill. I saw how everything changed after she left." "What was Mrs. Thompson like?" asked Matthew, curious. "Louise? She was pure light, intelligent, compassionate, full of life." Helen smiled at the memory. "When they discovered that Gabriel would have Down syndrome, Richard panicked. It was Louise who calmed him, who researched everything about the subject, who transformed what could be seen as a problem into a journey of love." "And what happened to her, if you don't mind me asking?" Helen sighed heavily. brain aneurysm. It was sudden. She was at the university, teaching, when it happened. Gabriel was only 5 years old. Matthew felt a tightness in his chest, imagining the trauma of that loss for a child, as young and sensitive as Gabriel. Richard, he didn't know how to handle it, continued Helen. He was always a man of action, of practical solutions. But there's no practical solution for grief, so he buried himself in work, surrounded Gabriel with specialists, and tried to continue as if he could fill that absence with efficiency and resources. Is that why he seems so distant from his son? Helen carefully considered the question. Richard loves Gabriel deeply, but loving and knowing how to demonstrate that love are different things, and after Louise left, I think he became afraid of getting too close and suffering again. And Denise, how does she fit into all this? Ah, Denise. Helen smiled sadly. She was Louise's assistant at the university before coming to work for Richard. It was a way of keeping her close, I suppose, and she is extremely competent, loyal. But in recent years, I think she began to see herself as indispensable, maybe even as a potential substitute for Louise in more aspects than just the professional one. She has feelings for Richard? Asked Matthew, surprised. It's not for me to speculate about that, Helen replied diplomatically. I'm just saying that this house and the people in it are more complicated than they appear at first glance. And you, Matthew, are the first person in a long time to bring a little light back. With those words, Helen stood up. Don't stay up. Too late. Gabriel wakes up early and has energy to spare. Helen, Matthew called before she walked away. Thank you for the chocolate and the conversation. She smiled gently. Welcome to the Thompson family, Matthew, with all its complications. The next 3 days, with Richard absent, established a comfortable rhythm between Matthew and Gabriel. In the morning, after Gabriel returned from school, they had lunch together. In the garden, then carried out educational activities that Matthew carefully disguised as games. On Saturday, when Richard finally returned from New York, he found the two at the pool. Gabriel, using arm floats, was proudly showing how he could float alone for a few seconds, while Matthew encouraged him from the edge. "Dad!" exclaimed Gabriel, upon seeing Richard, surprising both Matthew and his father with the clarity of the word. "Hello, son," replied Richard, visibly moved by the enthusiastic reception and the clear word. "I see you two are having fun." "Mr. Thompson, welcome back," greeted Matthew. "Gabriel has been making incredible progress in the water. Ryan was impressed yesterday." Richard approached the pool, still in his travel suit, observing his son with a new look. "Is that so? What else has he been learning?" "Why don't you ask him directly?" Matthew gently suggested. Richard seemed momentarily disconcerted, as if the idea of talking directly to his son was a new concept. "Of course. Gabriel, what have you learned this week?" Gabriel looked at Matthew, who nodded encouragingly. The boy then swam to the edge of the pool, close to his father, and raised his arms, making a gesture that Richard didn't immediately understand. "He wants you to help him out of the pool," explained Matthew. Hesitantly, Richard bent down and extended his hands, taking Gabriel under the arms and lifting him from the water. For a moment, father and son looked at each other, a silent connection passing between them. Then, to Richard's surprise, Gabriel wrapped his wet arms around his father's neck, hugging him tightly. "Dad came back," said Gabriel, the simple words clear. Richard closed his eyes, absorbing the moment, not caring that his Italian suit was being soaked by the pool water. When he opened them again, Matthew could see the shine of contained tears. "Yes, son, Dad came back, and is very, very happy to see you." That night, after Gabriel had been put to bed, Richard invited Matthew for a conversation in his office. Unlike what Matthew expected, the businessman wasn't formally seated behind his desk, but on one of the comfortable sofas, with a glass of whiskey in hand and his jacket and tie removed. "Sit down, Matthew. Would you like a drink?" "No, thank you, sir." Richard slowly swirled the amber liquid in his glass, thoughtful. "Denise told me about the incident on Wednesday, Gabriel's anxiety attack. Yes, it was a difficult moment, but he recovered quickly. She also told me how you handled the situation." Impressive. Richard took a sip of his drink. You know, I hired the best specialists in the country to work with Gabriel. People with decades of experience, doctorates, international publications, and none of them achieved what you've accomplished in just 1 week. I didn't do anything extraordinary, Mr. Thompson. I just treated Gabriel as Gabriel, not as a diagnosis or a problem to be solved. Richard nodded slowly. That's exactly what Louise used to say. He's not a syndrome, he's our son. He paused, as if the memories were simultaneously sweet and painful. When I lost her, something in me froze. I didn't know how to be a father without her by my side. So I did what I know how to do: delegate, manage, hire. I treated raising my son like a corporate project. Grief affects people in different ways, Matthew observed gently. There's no right or wrong. There is when it comes to a child's well-being. I saw Gabriel today, Matthew. Really saw him, perhaps for the first time in years. And you know what I realized? He's not the fragile and incapable boy I imagined. He's strong, intelligent, full of potential. He is extraordinary, agreed Matthew, and he's desperate to connect with his father. Richard looked at Matthew directly. How can I do that? How can I recover lost time? The question, so sincere and vulnerable coming from a man usually so controlled, touched Matthew deeply. Start with the basics. Spend time with him without distractions. No phone, no laptop, no staff around. Observe him, learn his preferences, his fears, his joys. Participate in activities he enjoys, even if they seem simple or childish. And mainly, show physical affection, hugs, head scratching, contact. Children with Down syndrome respond very well to these demonstrations. Richard absorbed the words in silence, and then did something unexpected. He placed his glass on the table and extended his hand to Matthew. Thank you, not just for the advice, but for helping me see my son again. Matthew shook the offered hand, feeling that something fundamental had changed in that relationship. I'm here to help, Mr. Thompson, both of you. On Sunday, to everyone's surprise in the house, Richard cancelled his usual work calls and announced that he would spend the entire day with Gabriel. He asked Matthew for suggestions, who recommended activities that he knew Gabriel loved, putting together puzzles, drawing, perhaps an outdoor walk. Around noon, Matthew discreetly observed from the veranda of his annex as Richard and Gabriel played in the garden. The businessman had exchanged his usual suit for jeans and a polo shirt, a look that would probably never be recorded by the business press, and was running after Gabriel in a lively game of tag. The boys' laughter echoed across the property, a sound that, according to Helen, had become rare since Louise's death. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Matthew smiled, feeling genuinely happy for both of them. He was so absorbed in watching them that he didn't notice Denise approaching until she spoke. This is your doing, I suppose. He turned, surprised. Denise was standing a few steps behind, him observing the same scene, her expression unreadable. Good morning, Ms. Fields. No, it's their doing. I just gave a little push. Denise walked until she was standing next to him on the veranda. You know, I've worked alongside Richard for 3 years. I've never seen him like this, not even when... She didn't complete the sentence, but it was obvious she was referring to Louise. People change, evolve, replied Matthew, especially when they find sufficient motivation. They observed in silence for a few minutes as Richard helped Gabriel climb onto his shoulders, the boy laughing uncontrollably. He called me to his office last night, Denise finally revealed. Asked me to transfer some of my responsibilities with Gabriel to other staff so that I could focus more on executive matters. Matthew didn't know what to respond immediately, realizing the complexity of the situation. I'm sorry if that upset you. To his surprise, Denise laughed softly. Curiously, it didn't. It was a relief. I was never trained to care for children, much less one with special needs. I did the best I could because I was desperate to help Richard after Louise, after what happened. But the truth is that Gabriel deserves someone who truly understands his needs. She turned to face him directly. Someone like you. Thank you for saying that, replied Matthew, genuinely touched. I know our start wasn't the best. I was territorial and unfair, she admitted, but seeing the change in Gabriel and now in Richard, well, it would be hard to maintain resentment. At that moment, Richard noticed the two on the veranda and waved, calling them. "Matthew, Denise, come join us. Gabriel wants to show something." Matthew and Denise exchanged a look of mutual understanding before descending to the garden, where Gabriel was anxiously waiting to show a collection of colorful stones he had found near the fountain. "Look, Thew, pretty," exclaimed the boy, extending his small hands full of stones. "They're beautiful, champ," praised Matthew, bending down to examine the treasure. "We can use them for our art project tomorrow." "What project is that?" asked Richard, interested. "We're creating a tactile mural," explained Matthew. "Different textures to stimulate sensory perception. These stones would be perfect for the rough section." Can I participate in this project?" asked Richard hesitantly, as if fearing a negative. Matthew smiled broadly. "Of course. The more hands, the better the result. Right, Gabriel?" Gabriel looked at his father, then at Matthew, and then, to everyone's surprise, took Richard's hand and Matthew's hand, joining them. "Friends," he declared simply. The following days brought a new dynamic to the Thompson house. Richard, still busy with his business, made a point of reserving at least 1 hour a day exclusively for Gabriel, sometimes just to have dinner together, other times to participate in the activities that Matthew planned. The relationship between Matthew and Denise also evolved from antagonism to mutual respect. She frequently consulted him on how to best communicate with Gabriel in the moments when she needed to interact with the boy, and he appreciated the efficiency with which she reorganized Richard's schedule to include more family time. The most notable change, however, was in Gabriel. The boy who rarely spoke now tried to pronounce new words every day, inspired by the positive attention he received with each attempt. His anxiety attacks became less frequent, and his confidence visibly grew. On a rainy Tuesday, when Gabriel was at school, Matthew took advantage of the free time to organize his notes on the boy's progress. He was focused in his annex when he heard knocks on the door. To his surprise, it was Richard, holding a folder and looking unusually nervous. "Matthew, sorry to interrupt. May I come in?" "Of course, Mr. Thompson, please." Richard entered, observing the modest but well-organized space. On the walls, Matthew had pasted some of the drawings that Gabriel had made for him, along with photos of the two during activities. "Looks like you've really settled in here," commented Richard. "I try to make any place where I live a little more personal," explained Matthew. "Please, sit down." Richard settled into one of the simple chairs, placing the folder on the small center table. "I brought something I'd like you to see." He opened the folder, revealing detailed architectural plans. "These are the plans for an expansion of the house. I want to create a complete educational space for Gabriel, with all the resources he might need as he grows." Matthew examined the plans, impressed with the level of detail. There were areas for physical therapy, occupational therapy, music room, mini library, and even a covered and heated pool for exercises during the winter. "This is amazing, Mr. Thompson. Gabriel will love it." "I want your professional opinion," continued Richard. "As an educator in training and someone who understands Gabriel's needs better than anyone now, is there anything you would add or modify?" Matthew reflected for a moment, genuinely touched by the trust placed in his judgment. "Well, I think it would be important to include a space for socialization. Gabriel needs to interact with other children, both neurotypical and with special needs. Perhaps an area that could be easily adapted for small events, group meetings." "Excellent idea." Richard made a note in the margin of the plan. "Anything else?" I see you've already included a music room, which is great. Gabriel responds very well to sound stimuli. But perhaps we could expand to a studio for arts in general. Painting, sculpture, maybe even photography when he's a bit older. Artistic expression is a powerful form of communication for children, like him. Richard nodded, making more notes. "Perfect. I'll implement these suggestions immediately." He hesitated before continuing. "There's another matter I'd like to discuss." "I'm listening." "I've been closely following Gabriel's progress these last few weeks. The transformation is, well, it's nothing short of miraculous, and it's thanks to you. It's the joint work of everyone, Mr. Thompson. The therapists, the school, and especially your growing involvement have made all the difference. Richard smiled, appreciating the modesty. Still, your role has been fundamental, and as such, I'd like to formalize your position permanently. Permanently? Yes. I want to offer you a long-term contract with substantially increased benefits, including permanent housing in the new wing we're building, a vehicle at your disposal, and funding for you to continue your studies up to a doctorate, if you so desire. Matthew was momentarily speechless, the offer exceeding his most optimistic expectations. It's extremely generous, sir. I don't know what to say. Say that you accept, replied Richard simply. Gabriel needs you. And frankly, so do I. You've brought life back to this house, Matthew. Before Matthew could respond, Richard's phone rang. He checked the caller ID and frowned. I need to take this. It's about that acquisition we're negotiating. Think about my offer. We'll talk later. After Richard left, Matthew remained seated, processing the conversation. The offer was tempting: financial security for him and his family, unparalleled educational opportunity, and the chance to continue meaningful work with Gabriel. However, something bothered him. The idea of becoming a permanent employee of the Thompsons, as beneficial as it might be, would also mean giving up his original plans to work with various children in a school environment, to apply his knowledge more broadly. His reflections were interrupted by the sound of his cell phone. It was a message from his mother, asking when he could visit, as Isabella was missing him. Matthew smiled sadly, feeling the weight of responsibilities divided between his biological family and the family that now also welcomed him. That night, after putting Gabriel to bed, Matthew walked to the garden, seeking clarity under the starry sky. To his surprise, he found Helen sitting on one of the benches, contemplating the full moon. "Restless mind?" she asked when she saw him approach. "Quite," admitted Matthew, sitting beside her. "Richard offered me a permanent contract today." "I'm not surprised. He would be foolish to let you escape. The problem is that I don't know if it's what I really want for my life. I love working with Gabriel, but I always imagined my career in a broader educational context, and there's my family." Helen nodded understandingly. "Difficult decisions. But you know, Matthew, sometimes the universe puts opportunities in our path, not necessarily as a final destination, but as bridges to something greater." "What do you mean?" "Think about the impact you've had here, not just on Gabriel, but on Richard, on Denise, on all of us. Perhaps your purpose goes beyond being just a tutor to one boy. Perhaps you're here to inspire a greater change." Helen's words echoed deeply in Matthew, offering a new perspective that he hadn't considered. The next day, when Gabriel returned from school, he seemed unusually quiet. During lunch, he barely touched his favorite food and answered Matthew's questions with monosyllables or nods. "Is everything okay, champ? Did something happen at school today?" Gabriel just shrugged, avoiding eye contact, atypical behavior for him in recent times. Concerned, Matthew contacted the school and spoke with Gabriel's teacher, who confirmed that the boy had been withdrawn and that an incident had occurred during recess. Some older classmates had made unkind comments about his appearance and his way of speaking. With a heavy heart, Matthew returned to Gabriel, who was now scribbling somber drawings in his notebook, another anomaly for someone who usually produced images full of color and movement. "Gabriel," Matthew began gently, sitting next to him, "your teacher told me what happened today. I'm sorry those children were mean to you." The boy continued drawing, but Matthew noticed a silent tear running down his cheek. "You know, when other people say bad things, it says more about them than about us." He paused, searching for the right words. "Remember the book we read yesterday, about the little bird that was different from all the others?" Gabriel nodded slightly. "And what happened at the end of the story?" The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Bird, special, flew higher." "Exactly. He was different, but that difference made him special, capable of things that others couldn't do." Matthew took the pencil and began to draw next to Gabriel's drawing. "You are special too, Gabriel, and you have qualities that many other children don't have." "Which ones?" asked Gabriel, finally looking at Matthew. "Well, you have a huge heart, first of all. Remember how you shared your snack with that lost kitten last week? and you have an incredible memory for drawings and stories, and you can see beauty in things that others don't even notice, like those little stones in the garden." Gabriel watched, as Matthew drew a cartoon version of him with a superhero cape. "Being different isn't bad, Gabriel. It's what makes you, you. And I, your dad, Helen, all of us love exactly who you are." The boy considered the words for a moment, then took a colored pencil and added a large red heart on the superhero cape in the drawing. "Super Gabriel," he pronounced clearly. "That's right, Super Gabriel, the boy with the strongest heart in the world." That small conversation seemed to melt the ice that had formed around Gabriel. Gradually, he began to smile and interact again, although with a new understanding in his eyes, the first glimpse of awareness that the world would not always be kind to him. When Richard returned from work that night, Matthew reported the incident at school. The businessman listened attentively, his face hardening with contained anger. "I'll call the principal immediately. This is unacceptable." "Mr. Thompson?" Matthew gently intervened. "With all due respect, this type of situation is unfortunately common. The most important thing is how we help Gabriel develop resilience to deal with it." "Are you suggesting we do nothing?" asked Richard, incredulous. "Not exactly. The school should certainly be notified and take educational measures, but the real long-term solution is more complex. Gabriel will need emotional tools to navigate in a world that won't always understand or accept his differences." Richard sat heavily, anger giving way to concern. "I never thought of it that way. I always believed I could protect him from everything." "No parent can completely protect their child from reality," replied Matthew, "but we can prepare them to face it. And how do we do that? By strengthening his self-esteem, teaching him to express himself, creating a safe environment where he can process his experiences, and gradually exposing him to diverse situations, so he develops social skills and resilience." Richard nodded slowly, processing the wisdom in Matthew's words. "You know, you have an extraordinary understanding of these issues for someone so young. I learned a lot from my sister. She faced similar situations growing up. And how is she now as an adult with Down syndrome? Isabella is still a teenager, she's 15, but she's developing wonderfully. She attends an inclusive school, has friends, participates in the church choir, loves swimming. She still faces challenges, of course, but she has a rich and meaningful life." An expression of hope crossed Richard's face. "That's what I want for Gabriel, a full life with all possible opportunities. And he will have it, Mr. Thompson. With your support and the right resources, his potential is unlimited." The school incident, as painful as it was, served as a catalyst for a new phase in Gabriel's educational approach. Matthew and Richard, along with the team of specialists, developed a more comprehensive plan that included not only academic development and therapies, but also social skills and self-advocacy, appropriate for his age. A week later, Matthew received a worrying phone call from his mother. Isabella had suffered a fall during her swimming class and needed to undergo tests to check for a possible back injury. Spine problems were common in people with Down syndrome. "I need to see her, Mom. I'll be there tonight," promised Matthew, his heart tight with worry. After hanging up, he immediately sought out Richard to explain the situation. The businessman, who was in a meeting with some executives, interrupted everything upon seeing Matthew's distressed expression. "What happened?" he asked, dismissing the other men with a gesture. Matthew quickly explained his sister's situation and the need to visit her. "Of course you should go immediately," replied Richard without hesitation. "Anthony can take you right now. How long do you plan to stay?" "I'm not sure. It depends on the severity of the situation. Maybe a day or two." "Take as long as necessary. Your family is a priority. As for Gabriel, I'll explain the situation to him. Maybe it's an opportunity for us to spend more time together." Matthew felt deeply touched by the understanding. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I really appreciate your flexibility." Matthew, Richard, seemed hesitant. "If there's anything your family needs, specialists, medical equipment, transfer to a better hospital, please don't hesitate to ask. I have contacts at the best hospitals in the country." "That's very kind, thank you. I hope it won't be necessary, but it's comforting to know I can count on you." An hour later, Matthew was in the car with Anthony, heading to his home in Riverside. His mind oscillated between concern for Isabella and apprehension about how Gabriel would handle his temporary absence, especially after the recent episode of separation anxiety. When he arrived home, he found his mother and Isabella in the living room. His sister was lying on the couch, seeming more bored than in pain. "Thu!" she exclaimed when she saw him, trying to get up. "Easy, Bella, don't get up." Matthew hurried to the couch, bending down to hug her carefully. "How are you, Princess?" "Hurts a little," she admitted, pointing to her back. "But doctor said to stay still." Mrs. Cindy looked exhausted but relieved at her son's arrival. "The doctor at the clinic said we need to do an MRI to be sure, but he thinks it's just a mild contusion. She needs to rest for a few days." "And when are we doing this exam?" asked Matthew, concerned about the long lines in the public health system. "I got a slot for Monday at the municipal hospital. A week's wait, which is practically a miracle in the public system." Matthew nodded, thinking quickly. A week was a long time to wait if there was something serious. Perhaps it was time to accept Richard's offer of help. "Mom, I think I can get this exam done more quickly. Let me make some calls." While Mrs. Cindy prepared tea in the kitchen, Matthew called Richard, explaining the situation. The response was immediate. "Consider it done. I'll ask Denise to schedule at New York Presbyterian Hospital for tomorrow morning. A car will pick you up at 8 a.m. Matthew barely had time to thank him before Richard continued. "Oh, and Gabriel asked to send a drawing to your sister. He's emailing it now." Deeply touched by the gesture, Matthew hung up and checked his email on his phone. There was a colorful drawing made by Gabriel, 2 figures holding hands, a larger one labeled as Thew and a smaller one as Thew's friend, both with huge smiles and hearts around them. He showed the drawing to Isabella, who smiled widely. "Pretty, who made it?" "Remember that special boy I told you about? Gabriel? He made it for you." Isabella studied the drawing again. "Is he like me?" "Yes, Bella. He has Down syndrome, like you. And he's amazing, like you. I want to meet him. We can be friends." The idea illuminated something in Matthew's mind, a possible solution to several issues he had been considering. The next day, as promised, a driver, not Anthony, but another, Thompson employee, picked up Matthew, his mother, and Isabella for the appointment at New York Presbyterian. The contrast between the care at the high-standard private hospital and the family's usual experience in the public system was impressive. In a few hours, Isabella had been seen by an orthopedist specializing in spine problems in people with Down syndrome, undergone the MRI, and received the diagnosis, a mild contusion without structural compromise, requiring only rest and physical therapy for a few weeks. "Mr. Sullivan," said the doctor, addressing Matthew, "we've already arranged for the physical therapy sessions. Dr. Thompson requested that everything be covered by him." Mrs. Cindy looked at her son, confused. "Dr. Thompson? Who is that?" "Just my employer, Mom. He offered to help." On the way back home, Mrs. Cindy finally got a moment alone with her son, while Isabella napped in the back seat of the luxury vehicle. "Matthew, what kind of employer does all this for an employee he's known for just a few weeks? And this car, this hospital, it's not just common business generosity." Matthew sighed, recognizing it was time for a deeper conversation about his situation. "It's complicated, Mom. Richard, Mr. Thompson, isn't just rich, he's, well, a billionaire. And the relationship I've built with Gabriel is very meaningful to him. I think he's grateful in a way that transcends the normal employer-employee relationship." "And how do you feel about all this? This family is clearly becoming attached to you." "It's reciprocal," admitted Matthew. "Gabriel is a wonderful child, and seeing him evolve has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. And Richard, well, he's really trying to be a better father." "And what about your plans, your career? You always dreamed of working with inclusive education in public schools, helping children who don't have access to all these resources." Matthew looked out the window, watching the city pass by. "I've been thinking a lot about that, Mom, and I think I'm starting to envision a possibility that could unite these two worlds." When he returned to the Thompson mansion 2 days later, Matthew was greeted by an extremely anxious and excited Gabriel. "Thew back! Thew back!" exclaimed the boy, running through the entrance hall as soon as he heard the car park. Matthew bent down to receive the enthusiastic hug. "I missed you, champ. How were these days with your dad?" "Good. Made pizza. And camping in living room." Richard appeared right behind with a tired but genuine smile. "He's being modest. We also had a painting class, a gardening session, and watched every Pixar movie ever made. Twice." Matthew laughed, noting Richard's slightly disheveled hair, a look very distant from the perfectly composed image the businessman usually maintained. "Sounds like you had a lot of fun." "It was enlightening," admitted Richard. "I never realized how much energy this kid has, and how much creativity. He taught me to make origami, did you know? Apparently, the occupational therapist has been working on that with him for months." Gabriel pulled Matthew's hand. "Come see. We made room for Bella." Confused, Matthew followed Gabriel to one of the guest rooms near his annex. To his surprise, the room had been completely transformed into a colorful and welcoming space with a state-of-the-art adjustable hospital bed, physical therapy equipment, and walls decorated with drawings that clearly had been made by Gabriel. "What is this?" asked Matthew, astonished. Richard suddenly looked uncertain. "Gabriel was very concerned when he heard that your sister was hurt. He insisted that we should help her get better. It was his idea to prepare a room for her here." "And you just did this in 2 days?" Richard shrugged. "I have resources and contacts. I thought it would be good for Gabriel to feel that he was helping. And I thought that perhaps, that your sister could benefit from staying here during her recovery. We have space, adequate equipment, and Gabriel's team of physical therapists could care for her too." Matthew was speechless, divided between gratitude for the generosity and concern about what his mother would think of such an offer. "It's very kind, Mr. Thompson, but I don't know if my mother—" "Your mother can come too, of course," interrupted Richard. "There are enough rooms. It would be good for Gabriel to meet other children with Down syndrome, and I thought it might be comforting for you to have your family nearby." Gabriel looked anxiously from one to the other, waiting for Matthew's reaction. "Bella, come, please." Faced with those hopeful eyes, Matthew felt his heart melt. "I'll talk to my mother about it, champ. I can't promise anything, but we'll see what's possible, okay?" Gabriel nodded enthusiastically and ran to show Matthew a particularly elaborate drawing he had made to decorate the headboard of the bed. Later, when Gabriel finally went to sleep, after demanding 3 different stories to make up for Matthew's absence, Richard invited the young man for a conversation in his office. "I apologize if I crossed any boundaries with the room," began Richard, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "It was an impulse, motivated by Gabriel's excitement." "It was an incredibly generous gesture," replied Matthew sincerely. "I'm just concerned that my mother might feel uncomfortable. She's a proud woman, used to handling her own problems." Richard nodded understandingly. "I understand that. I deeply respect your mother for raising 2 children alone, especially with the additional challenges that Isabella must present. But perhaps we can find a way to offer help that preserves her dignity." "Perhaps," agreed Matthew thoughtfully. "Actually, this whole situation has made me reflect on something bigger." "Which would be?" Matthew took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. "Since I started working with Gabriel, I've seen the extraordinary impact that adequate resources can have on the development of a child with special needs. He has access to therapies, equipment, personalized education, things that most families can only dream of." "Including your own family," observed Richard. "Exactly, and it made me think, what about the other children? Those who don't have a father with unlimited resources, children like my sister, who depend on the public system and the tireless dedication of parents who often need to work multiple jobs to provide the minimum necessary." Richard studied Matthew attentively, intrigued by the direction of the conversation. "Where are you going with this? Remember my condition when I accepted this job, that I would continue my academic training? Well, the final project of my course is to develop an educational intervention proposal, and I've been thinking about creating a comprehensive support program for families of children with Down syndrome, something that could democratize access to resources, knowledge, and therapies." Richard's expression lit up with understanding. "And you would like to implement this beyond the academic scope, make it real?" "Yes, an integrated center that would offer not only therapies and complementary education for the children, but also guidance and support for families, training for caregivers, awareness for schools, something that could really make a difference. On a larger scale. "It's an ambitious vision," commented Richard, a smile slowly forming on his face. "It would need substantial funding, physical space, qualified staff. I know it's probably a distant dream." "I could finance it," interrupted Richard directly. "In fact, the Thompson Foundation has been looking for a new social project to support. Something meaningful with real impact, not just for corporate marketing." Matthew looked at Richard, momentarily speechless. "Are you serious?" "Absolutely. Think about it. A model center for children with Down syndrome and their families. We would start here in New York, but with potential to expand to other cities. We could establish partnerships with universities for research, with the public health system for referrals." As Richard spoke, the dream that Matthew barely dared to articulate began to take shape as a real possibility. The idea of uniting. His passion for inclusive teaching with the resources that Richard could provide was almost dizzying. "This would change lives," said Matthew, his voice almost a whisper, "including my sister's. And it would be a way to transform what we've been doing with Gabriel into something that would benefit hundreds, perhaps thousands of other children." Richard paused, studying Matthew carefully. "That's what you want, isn't it? Not just to work with one child, but to create a systemic impact." "Yes," admitted Matthew. "It has always been my long-term dream. I just didn't imagine I could achieve it so early in my career." "Sometimes the universe conspires in our favor," replied Richard with a smile. "Think of it as a partnership, your vision, knowledge, and dedication combined with my resources and connections. We could start planning immediately, incorporating your academic proposal as an initial basis. And what about Gabriel? I would promise to continue working with him." "Gabriel would be the first beneficiary, of course. In fact, I imagine the center initially operating in a space here on the property. Perhaps an adaptation of that expansion we're planning. Gabriel could interact with other children, socialize, while continuing to receive personalized attention." Matthew felt a wave of emotion so intense that he needed a moment to regain his composure. "Mr. Thompson, Richard, I don't know how to thank you for considering this." "Don't thank me yet. There's a lot of work ahead. I propose the following. Invite your family to spend a weekend here. Let them meet Gabriel, see the work we're doing. We can discuss these ideas all together. See how your mother and your sister would feel about participating in this project. That would be perfect." On the following Saturday, after much persuasion and assurances that it would not be an inconvenience, Mrs. Cindy and Isabella arrived at the Thompson mansion. Matthew anxiously watched as Anthony led them up the driveway, concerned about how his simple family would react to that environment of opulence. Isabella, wearing an orthopedic boot to stabilize her sprained ankle, looked at the mansion with wide-eyed admiration. Mrs. Cindy, on the other hand, seemed deeply uncomfortable, nervously adjusting the best dress she owned. "Mom, relax," whispered Matthew, hugging her. "They're normal people, I promise." "Normal people don't live in castles, Matthew," she replied, making him laugh. Gabriel and Richard were waiting in the entrance hall. The boy was jumping with excitement, holding a bouquet of flowers that he himself had helped pick from the garden. When Isabella got out of the car with help from Matthew and a cane, Gabriel momentarily froze, observing her intensely. Then, to everyone's surprise, he slowly approached, extending the bouquet. "Hi, Bella," he said clearly. "Hi, Gabriel." Isabella smiled broadly, accepting the flowers. "Thank you, Gabriel. They're beautiful." The two observed each other for a moment, recognizing something familiar and comfortable in the other. Without any hesitation, Gabriel extended his hand to Isabella, who naturally accepted it. "Come see my room, has many toys." Isabella looked at her mother, who nodded, still dazed by the grandeur of the environment. Gabriel carefully guided Isabella, adapting his pace to her slower rhythm with the cane, a surprising consideration for a child his age. Richard approached Mrs. Cindy, politely extending his hand. "Mrs. Sullivan, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. Your son has been a blessing to our family." Mrs. Cindy shook his hand, still visibly tense. "Mr. Thompson, Thank you so much for what you did for Isabella at the hospital. It was the least I could do. Please come in. Helen has prepared a special lunch, and I imagine you're curious to see where Matthew has been living these past few weeks. The weekend went surprisingly harmoniously. Gabriel and Isabella formed an instant connection, communicating in their own language of gestures, simple words, and laughter. He proudly showed her his achievements, and Isabella, in turn, taught him new words and songs she had learned in the church choir. Mrs. Cindy, initially reserved, began to relax when she realized that despite the evident wealth, there was a genuinely welcoming atmosphere in that house. Helen received her in the kitchen, where the two exchanged recipes and stories, finding common ground as women who had faced adversities while caring for others. On Sunday afternoon, while Gabriel and Isabella played in the garden under Matthew's supervision, Richard invited Mrs. Cindy for a conversation in his office. He explained the idea of the support center for children with Down syndrome, explaining how it had been inspired by Matthew's work with Gabriel. Your son has a special gift, Mrs. Sullivan, not just technical but human. He sees potential where others see limitations, and I think he inherited that from someone, he added with a respectful smile. Mrs. Cindy, more comfortable after 2 days in the mansion, nodded. Matthew has always been like that, since he was young. When we found out about Isabella's condition, many suggested we put her up for adoption, including his father, who abandoned us soon after. But Matthew, only 10 years old at the time, was the first to say that she was perfect exactly as she was. It's that perspective we want to bring to other families, explained Richard. And I would like you and Isabella to be part of it, in some way that you feel comfortable, perhaps as a consultant for newly diagnosed families, or perhaps just sharing your experience. Me? Mrs. Cindy seemed surprised. I'm just a cleaner with incomplete high school education, Mr. Thompson. You're a mother who raised 2 exceptional children alone, one of them with special needs, and did it without the resources that someone like me has at their disposal. Your practical knowledge is worth more than many diplomas. Mrs. Cindy's eyes watered. When Matthew told me about this idea, I thought it was just a distant dream, something for the future. I didn't imagine it could be real so quickly. I've learned that some opportunities should not be postponed, replied Richard, his gaze wandering to the window where he could see Gabriel and Isabella laughing together. Life is more fragile and precious than we imagine. That night, as Matthew's family prepared to return to Riverside, Richard made an unexpected proposal that Isabella stay at the mansion for 2 weeks to take advantage of intensive physical therapy sessions with the team that cared for Gabriel. Mrs. Cindy could visit her daily or even stay too if she wished. After some hesitation and a private conversation with Matthew, Mrs. Cindy accepted the offer, mainly because Isabella was radiant with the possibility of spending more time with her new friend. Just so you know, commented Mrs. Cindy to Richard as she said goodbye, I'm allowing this because I trust my son's judgment, not because I'm dazzled by all this. Richard smiled, respecting her frankness. It's perfectly understandable, Mrs. Sullivan, and I promise we'll take good care of Isabella. As Mrs. Cindy's car disappeared through the gate, Matthew felt a strange mixture of emotions. He had started this journey as a simple waiter, trying to help a boy during lunch. Now he was at the center of a transformation that affected not only Gabriel and his family, but also his own family, and potentially many others in the future. In the following weeks, the Thompson mansion gained a new energy with Isabella's presence. Gabriel flourished with the company of someone who understood him intuitively, while Isabella greatly benefited from the intensive therapies that accelerated her recovery. Matthew divided his time between caring for the 2 children, continuing his studies, and beginning to develop, with the help of Richard and a team of consultants, the project of what was beginning to be called the Louise Thompson Center for Inclusive Development. One afternoon, as he worked on his laptop in the garden, supervising Gabriel and Isabella playing nearby, Denise approached with a folder of documents. The preliminary contracts for the acquisition of the adjacent land, she explained, handing the folder to Matthew. Richard thought you might like to review the plans before the meeting with the architects tomorrow. Thank you, Denise. Matthew accepted the folder, still surprised by the change in dynamics between them. Since the incident with Gabriel and the subsequent frank conversation, Denise had become an unexpected ally in the center project. She hesitated before moving away, observing the children playing. "You know, I never thought I'd see this happen." "What?" "Gabriel truly happy. Richard involved. This house full of life again." She smiled slightly. "Louise would have loved it." "Did you know her well?" asked Matthew, curious about the woman who had left such a deep mark on that family. "I worked with her at the university for 2 years before coming here," replied Denise, sitting on a nearby bench. "She was extraordinary, academically brilliant, but also deeply human. It was she who encouraged me to continue my studies, who recommended me to Richard when I needed a better-paying job to take care of my sick mother." The mention of the sick mother surprised Matthew. It was the first glimpse of personal vulnerability that Denise shared. "After she was gone," continued Denise, "I felt I had a debt to her, that I needed to help Richard and Gabriel move forward somehow." She paused, her eyes fixed on the children. "I think I confused things at some point. I began to believe I was indispensable, that only I knew what was best for them." "It's understandable," replied Matthew gently. "You care about them." "Yes, I care. And that's why I'm happy that you've entered their lives, even though initially I felt the opposite. You brought something they desperately needed and that I couldn't offer." Before Matthew could respond, they were interrupted by alarmed shouts. Gabriel had climbed a low tree to get a lost ball, but now he was stuck, clinging to a branch, clearly frightened. "Gabriel," Matthew ran to the tree, positioning himself under the boy. "It's okay, champ, I'm here below, I'll catch you." "I'm scared," shouted Gabriel, his hands gripping the branch tightly. "I know, but you're brave. Remember Super Gabriel? He's not afraid of anything." Isabella, leaning on her cane, approached the tree. "Gabriel, look at me." The boy, trembling, looked down. "You can do it," encouraged Isabella. "Let go of the branch and Thew will catch you." The confidence in Isabella's voice seemed to reach Gabriel in a way that no adult could. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and released the branch, falling directly into Matthew's arms, who caught him safely. "I got you, champ. You were very brave." Gabriel, still trembling but visibly relieved, hugged Matthew tightly. "Thew caught. Thew always catches." Those simple words profoundly affected Matthew. In a child's innocence was a fundamental truth: trust. Gabriel trusted that Matthew would always be there to catch him when he fell, literally and figuratively. That night, after putting both children to bed, Matthew found Richard in his office working on some documents. "Are the children okay?" asked the businessman, removing his reading glasses. "Perfectly. Exhausted after the tree adventure, but fine." Matthew smiled, sitting in the chair in front of the desk. "Denise gave me the plans for the land. It looks promising." "Yes, it's almost 2 acres adjacent to the property, more than enough space for the center and future expansions." Richard paused, studying Matthew. "You seem thoughtful tonight." "I'm reflecting on how life takes unexpected turns. 2 months ago, I was just a waiter struggling to pay for college. Now I'm involved in planning a center that could impact hundreds of families." "And that worries you?" "Not exactly. It's more a feeling of responsibility, of wanting to make sure we're doing things the right way for the right reasons." Richard nodded understandingly. "It's a valid concern, but I have confidence in your vision, Matthew, and in your integrity." "Thank you for that." Matthew hesitated before continuing. "There's something else I've been thinking about Gabriel, about his future." "What would that be?" "He's evolving rapidly. Soon he'll be ready for new challenges, new experiences, and I wonder if he wouldn't benefit from an inclusive school instead of the current special school." Richard's expression closed slightly. "A regular school, with children, without Down syndrome?" "A school that includes all children with adequate support." Gabriel has much to offer, and much to gain from these interactions. See how he has flourished just with Isabella's presence. Imagine how much he could grow in a truly diverse environment. Richard remained silent for a long moment, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. "I have concerns, Matthew. The world can be cruel to those who are different. You yourself saw what happened at that special school. Imagine at a regular school. That's precisely why inclusion is so important, Matthew argued gently. So that all children learn from an early age that differences don't diminish anyone's value. That's how we change the mindset of future generations. And if he suffers, if he's rejected, he will have challenges, yes, like any child. But he will also have all the necessary support, at home, at the center we're planning, and at the school itself. And more importantly, he will have the confidence and love of a father who believes in his potential. Richard stood up and walked to the window, observing the gardens illuminated by the moon. When Louise was pregnant and we discovered about the syndrome, I spent sleepless nights researching, preparing myself for all possible medical problems, for the necessary therapies. But I never prepared for this. To see him grow, develop, become ready for the world. Maybe because deep down you wanted to protect him from that world, suggested Matthew. Yes, and maybe also because, secretly, I didn't believe he would reach this point. Richard turned, his eyes shining with contained emotion. It's not something I'm proud of, but it's the truth. I underestimated my own son. We all underestimate people with Down syndrome in one way or another, replied Matthew. It's what society teaches us to do. But we're learning better now, aren't we? A slow smile formed on Richard's face. Yes, we are. Thanks to you. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. 3 months passed, bringing significant changes for everyone involved. The Louise Thompson Center was rapidly taking shape, with construction advancing on the land adjacent to the mansion. Matthew, now graduated in education and beginning a specialization in inclusive education, divided his time between working with Gabriel, participating in planning the center, and writing academic articles about his experience. Isabella, completely recovered from her injury, now regularly visited the mansion to play with Gabriel and participate in the center's first experimental activities. Mrs. Cindy had accepted a part-time position as a consultant for newly diagnosed families, sharing her valuable practical experience. Gabriel, perhaps the most impressive transformation, had evolved remarkably. His vocabulary had expanded, his confidence had increased, and he demonstrated an insatiable curiosity about the world beyond the mansion walls. After many discussions and careful visits, Richard had finally agreed to enroll him in a renowned inclusive school for the next semester. One Sunday afternoon, while the expanded family, Richard, Gabriel, Matthew, Mrs. Cindy, Isabella, and even Denise, relaxed in the garden after lunch, Helen discreetly approached Matthew. "There's someone at the door asking for you," she said quietly. "A man named Steve from the restaurant." Surprised, Matthew excused himself and headed to the mansion entrance. There he found his former manager from Flavors and Aromas, looking out of place and nervous. "Steve, what a surprise. Is everything okay?" "Matthew, sorry for showing up like this without warning. I tried calling, but your number changed." Steve seemed genuinely distressed. "No problem. What happened?" Steve took a deep breath. "It's John, our chef. Remember him? His son, Michael, was diagnosed with Down syndrome 3 months ago. The boy is only 6 months old, and John, well, he's devastated. He doesn't know where to start, what resources to seek, how to help the baby. And you thought of me," concluded Matthew, immediately understanding. "Yes. I remembered how you helped that boy at the restaurant, how you seemed to understand exactly what to do. I thought maybe you could give John some advice, recommend doctors, therapies, anything that helps." Matthew felt a wave of emotion, realizing the synchronicity of the moment. Here was exactly the type of family that the Louise Thompson Center intended to help. Newly diagnosed parents, overwhelmed with medical information, not knowing how to navigate this new territory. "Steve, you couldn't have come at a more opportune moment?" Matthew smiled, placing his hand on the ex-manager's shoulder. "Actually, we're developing a support center for families exactly like John's. It's not officially open yet, but we can already offer guidance, contacts, and even some initial therapies." Steve's eyes widened. "Seriously? That would be incredible." "John is desperate, doesn't even know where to begin. I know that feeling well. Tell him to come here with his wife and the baby next week. We'll do an initial assessment and put together a personalized plan for Michael. Matthew, I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to. In fact, I should be thanking you. Me? Why? Matthew smiled, looking at the mansion where his life had changed so dramatically. For scheduling me to serve that specific table on that specific day. Sometimes, Steve, the universe works in mysterious ways. When Matthew returned to the garden and shared the conversation with the others, Richard immediately offered complete support for the chef's family. Our first official case, he commented, visibly moved. Louise would be proud. Gabriel, who was playing nearby and had overheard the conversation, approached Matthew with a serious expression. Baby like me? Yes, champ. A special baby, like you were when you were born. He will need friends, declared Gabriel with conviction. I can be his friend. The simple and sincere comment brought tears to the eyes of several adults present. Of course you can, replied Matthew, hugging him. You'll be a great friend and an amazing example for him. In the following weeks, news about the developing center began to spread discreetly among families of children with Down syndrome. What had begun as an informal consultation for the chef's son soon transformed into guidance sessions for 5, then 10 families. Richard, seeing the immediate impact, accelerated the construction schedule and hired more specialists for the team. One night during dinner, Gabriel made an unexpected announcement. I want to help at the center. Richard and Matthew exchanged surprised looks. What do you mean, son? Asked Richard. I want to teach the other boys, like Thew teaches me. Matthew felt his heart expand with pride. That's wonderful, Gabriel. You would be an excellent helper. Not helper, corrected Gabriel with surprising clarity. Teacher, like Thew. The simple but profound declaration crystallized something that had been forming in Matthew's mind for weeks. The center should not be just about specialists helping families, but about creating a space where people with Down syndrome could develop their full potential, including the ability to lead and teach. The following morning, Matthew presented Richard with an expanded proposal for the center, including a specific program of young mentors where teenagers and adults with Down syndrome, properly trained, could assist in working with younger children. Think of the impact, he enthusiastically explained. Newly diagnosed parents seeing not just professionals explaining about the syndrome, but real people with Down demonstrating everything that's possible. It would be transformative. Richard, impressed with the vision, not only approved the idea but suggested documenting the entire process to create educational materials that could be shared with other institutions across the country. The official inauguration of the Louise Thompson Center for Inclusive Development happened 6 months after that fateful afternoon at the restaurant. What had begun as a simple gesture of kindness, a waiter helping a boy to eat, had transformed into a model institution with first-rate facilities, a multidisciplinary team, and a revolutionary approach to supporting people with Down syndrome and their families. On the day of the opening ceremony, the center was already serving more than 50 families, offering everything from early intervention for babies to vocational programs for young adults. Gabriel, formally dressed for the occasion, proudly accompanied his father and Matthew on a tour of the facilities for guests and press. At one point, a reporter asked Richard what had inspired him to create the center. I wasn't the one who had the initial inspiration, he replied, surprising many of those present. It was this young man by my side, Matthew Sullivan, who taught me to see my own son in a new way. And it was Gabriel, he placed his hand on his son's shoulder, who taught me the true meaning of unconditional love and human potential. Gabriel smiled at his father, and then, to everyone's surprise, took the microphone. Mom's Center will help many children, he declared clearly, and we'll teach that being different is good, being different is special. The simplicity and sincerity of his words perfectly captured the essence of the project, provoking emotional applause from everyone present. Later, after most of the guests had departed, Matthew found himself alone with Richard in the center's main hall. On the walls, photos of Louise alternated with colorful images of smiling children and inspirational phrases. She would be immensely proud, commented Matthew, observing Richard contemplate the portrait of his late wife. Yes, she would be. but not just of the center. Richard turned to face Matthew directly. She would be proud of Gabriel, of how he has evolved, of how he has opened up to the world. And that, my young friend, is largely thanks to you. It was a joint effort, replied Matthew modestly. From all of us. True, but it was you who initiated everything with a simple act of kindness on an ordinary workday. Richard smiled. You know what Louise always said? That the greatest transformations often begin with the simplest gestures. At that moment, Gabriel and Isabella entered the room running, followed by Mrs. Cindy and Helen, all laughing at some shared joke. Dad, do come see what we did, exclaimed Gabriel, pulling them by the hand toward one of the activity rooms. There on the main wall, the children had created a colorful mural with drawings, photos, and small objects. In the center, a phrase, written in large and slightly irregular letters, clearly Gabriel's work. Family is who loves us. Matthew felt tears in his eyes, recognizing the profound truth in that simple declaration. What had begun as a professional relationship, a temporary job, had transformed into something much more meaningful and lasting. Not just a friendship, but an expanded family, united not by blood ties, but by choice, by love, by a shared purpose. And as he watched Gabriel and Isabella proudly presenting their creation, Matthew realized that the true miracle wasn't in the impressive facilities of the center, the state-of-the-art equipment, or even the innovative programs they had developed. The true miracle was there, in the confident smile of a boy who once could barely eat alone in a restaurant, in Richard's proud posture, who had learned to be not just a provider but a present father, in the quiet joy of Mrs. Cindy, who now saw her life experience valued and shared, in Isabella's evolution, flourishing with new opportunities, in the transformation of a house once marked by absence into a vibrant home, full of life and purpose. And perhaps, reflected Matthew, the greatest miracle of all was the fact that a simple gesture of empathy, kneeling beside a struggling child, offering help without expectation of return, could trigger a chain reaction of kindness, healing, and transformation that would continue to expand far beyond those walls, touching countless lives in the future. Because in the end, that's how real change happens. Not through grand heroic gestures, but through small acts of kindness that, like ripples in a lake, spread in ever-widening circles, reaching shores we could never imagine. The end, dear reader. We hope this story has touched your heart. If you know someone with Down syndrome or another special condition, share this message of love and inclusion. Leave your comment telling us what you thought of the ending, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire and transform.